Norwegian immigration, we all think of Garrison Keillor and Lake Wobegon and the solid farmers, bachelor farmers of Minnesota. And by the time they started getting to this end of the country, all the farmland was taken up, and they would work their way over to the western part of Montana. And when they got here, oftentimes what they did was lumber work. They worked for the railroads, the mills. They were sawyers out in the woods. And so I picked to be close to Dina and Louis Sarheim. They were family friends. He worked for the railroad, was a conductor many years, retired. They did what a lot of people did. They had a place up at Flathead Lake on Big Arm Bay with a bunch of other Norwegians cheek to jowl along the shoreline, and they enjoyed having that. They went up there and would go fishing a lot. Dina, when she got here, worked as a housekeeper and a cook, and she cooked and kept house for the Keith family when they were on the north side of the river. And when they moved to the south side of the river, she actually moved with them and was the cook in the big house. And the big house is the big maroon brick, half a city block fraternity house, Sigma Nu. So she was the cook there. And years ago, when we did a remodeling job in the house, we tore that master bathroom out. It had a big porcelain tub, and the only way we could get it out was to beat it out. She was shocked that we took the tub out of that house, because that was such a big, fine house to be in. Some of the other Norwegians that came then were, I have a great uncle who was instrumental in early Missoula, and he was a masonry contractor. And some of the buildings that he worked on that he was the contractor for are the Wilma building, the Milwaukee Depot Boone and Crockett Club building, the Sentinel High School, or Hellgate High School, some part of the original building, so that they did more than just work in the woods and work on the railroad. They went ahead and they got other jobs doing other things. Another friend that came, that we knew, came to town, and he was born in Bergen, Norway, and his came over with his parents as a young child, started school up and spoke Norwegian, had to learn English and then be able to speak English, go through school. But education was important, so S.J. Knutson went on to get his eventually a master's degree in education, and was an administrator in the Missoula public school system for many years before he retired. There again, loved to be on the water. He had a cabin on the north side of Big Arm Bay, just across from the bay from Dina and Louis. There are other Norwegians. Sometimes they got here after there was the Dust Bowl era. It was dry. Dryland farming in North Dakota was not as good as it could be, so they would come to Missoula, where there was a little chance of making a living. So Martin Solheim ended up starting in Dakotas and eventually ended up here in Missoula. So we have several of those. Another one that was an old-time Missoula Norwegian was Moy, Oscar Marshall Moy, and his family lived up just below Marshall Canyon ski area, And he often talked about when he'd walk down the hill from basically the Marshall Mountain, just below where the lodge is up there, walk down and catch the electric trolley to go to school. So he caught the trolley that went between Missoula and Bonner, and used to ride that to get into school. There are a bunch of others that were the Langs, and Stoverud Jewelers was his family came over, and then the second generation became he was a jeweler. His brother not getting the name right now, but his brother was a janitor in the school system and worked in the school system. So but oftentimes they would try to do other things. Sounds
like they came not all at once, but
yeah, the ones that came to Western Montana came in the later, usually the turn of the century era. So oftentimes they'd be the ones that ended up here in the early 1900s, and so a lot of the Missoula settlers came later. They were, they maintained their heritage in Norway. The group that was coming at that time were basically Lutherans, and so they founded a church, the St. Paul Lutheran Church, and they did that in the early 1900s, and then by the late 1920s, they decided that they were going to build a building, so they built St. Paul Lutheran Church over by Hellgate High School. If you notice on the tombstone, though, the original records of St. Paul Lutheran Church are all in Norwegian, and when they built the church, it's St. Paul English Lutheran Church on the cornerstone. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to assimilate, and they wanted to say that we have our services in English. So by that time, contrasting that with in 1960 when I started college back in Minneapolis, or 66, one of the kids on the dorm was from northern Minnesota. He spoke English with a heavier Norwegian accent than my parents did, who came from Norway. And in fact, it was only just a few years before that their church had changed from Norwegian services to English services. And the difference being is that when they got to the Midwest, they tended to clump up in groups and stayed together. District-wise, they were all from the same valley or the same community, and they would come to the same spot and set up their farms in the same spot. Whereas by the time they got here, the population was already established, and so they blended in. They tried to assimilate very rapidly into this. So that's why they went to the English Lutheran Church. So it's not because they're from England. The other thing they did is they started the Sons of Norway, and they wanted to maintain some of the connections they had with Norway. So the Sons of Norway in Missoula the first one was founded in 1941, and then they met at various places. I remember going to meetings above in the Union Hall, and some of the meeting rooms in the Union Hall, and then for a number of years they met in the Oddfellows Hall, and then finally they were able to obtain the Pines building after it had been in a fire. They got it for the salvage value, and were able to restore the building and build the lodge building that they have out there. So it was very important that they maintain the connections, but they didn't really necessarily want to speak just Norwegian. So my wife's mother, her parents came from Norway, and born in eastern Montana, in Glendive, and there it was so important that she never learned Norwegian, whereas by the time I got here, it was okay for an immigrant family to still speak the mother tongue. So I can speak Norwegian a little bit. So just a little, some differences.
But they still maintain
Yeah.
the
You know, and we think about Norway as being a homogeneous Norwegian Lutheran community, and yet there were first immigrants that came over in big organized fashion were the sloopers in the early 1800s. And they were actually a religious group that was trying to escape what they perceived as some religious persecution and establish be able to practice the religion and not the state-run Lutheran religion. So even Norway had a little bit of dissension. A lot of those people ended up in some communities down in the Texas, Oklahoma area. So there's a Norwegian community down there of people that were dissenting from the strict Norwegian Lutheran tradition. So
separated themselves.
yeah, they're and you know, they sort of thought that they could get land and set up a big, you know, set up a community based on their principles and tenets. And then by the time they started settling western Montana, they were pretty much blended in. There's the family that lived over by the alternative high school, Eglunds, the Sundas, the Langs. There's a whole community out in Bonner, Milltown area that was there. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Yeah, we'll give you a little background on the Jews who end up in Missoula and the slow development of actually a community here in Missoula. In the 1870s, Butte and Helena were the big cities, and that's where the Jews were primarily in the state of Montana as well. There were a couple of early businessmen around 1880, a little before, a little bit after, who ended up in Missoula, who were actually fairly instrumental and important towards the development of Missoula, but particularly of the interest in the Jewish community. A fellow by the name of Jacob Leiser lost his fortune in Helena, went back to the Bay Area for a few years, got a little money again, and so the story goes that he walked from the Bay Area to Missoula. His daughter, Esther Leiser, was still living in the 1950. She died in 56 and is buried here. But her dad supposedly was the first Jew in Missoula. So my dad actually wrote a poem about this. So let me share his poem. The first Jew in Missoula. They typically came from far away, from across the Atlantic wide, to escape the fear of hunger or lash, to share Columbia's pride. One such was Jacob Leiser. From Germany, his home, after docking in New York City, said Jake, "No more shall I roam." But he was seeking adventure, so around the Horn he went, and landed in California. You'd think it was heaven sent. But Jacob Leiser was restless still, so off again with pack, he walked a long northeasterly way, said he, "There's no turning back." He lived off the bounties of nature, and many a native he met. After a long and arduous journey, he stopped at a place called De Smet. Jake put down his roots and opened a store in that well-watered, five-valleyed place in a spot now known to Missoula. Met the Salish face to face. The story is told by his daughter, described their dealings as open and fair. Too bad that our treatment of Indian folk to that standard could not always compare. So a toast to Jacob Leiser, a pioneer through and through. Our city is the better because of people like him, for me and I hope for you. Anyway, so Jacob Leiser was here. He opened a little store on Front Street, East Front Street, just down from where the First Interstate Bank is right now. By 1880, another fellow two brothers actually came. Herman Cohn, who was a Bohemian-born Jewish fellow, and his brother Leopold came, and in the 1880s is listed as his business. He was a harness maker. So he started out with the horse trade. That was, I'm sure, something important here in Missoula. But by the within a few years, he had actually opened up a jewelry store. There was a store called Cohn's Jewelers that ended up on the corner of Higgins and Front. That was in the original Florence Hotel. That hotel was burned down and rebuilt in the 30s. In 1954-55, that store was sold to the Stoveruds. So Stoveruds Jewelry was originally Cohn Jewelers, and Cohn Jewelry put up that clock that's called Free Speech Corner, because the Wobblies made it famous there at Higgins, right by the Florence Hotel, at the intersection of Front and Higgins. So there were the Cohns. Irving Cohn then took it over for his father, and he's the one who sold. See, this is 56. He sold the business to the Stoveruds in about 54, 55. But backtracking, Herman Cohn was quite involved in civic goings-on here in Missoula. He was one of the 3 or 4 original businessmen who bought all this land for the cemetery. The idea was, he thought, well, Jews are going to be coming, and we're going to have a pretty good Jewish population. He set about a quarter of this whole area aside for the Jewish community. It never materialized. There was never a need for it. So over a series of about 4 or 5 different transactions, that property was given to other groups who wanted the property here. But this little section here is the, there are probably 20, 25 gravestones at least in this general area, which is known as the Jewish section. Not all of them are Jews who are here. In the tradition, as a Jew, if it's a Jewish cemetery, only Jews are allowed to be buried there. You don't have them mixed, but being Montana and being the United States, that didn't last very long. So that was really the situation, and I understand that the Cohns, especially Herman Cohn, was quite involved in buying. He was involved in a number of the buildings downtown. He made some money. He invested in Missoula over the years. All that then moved on to others. But I understand he was an important businessman downtown Missoula. At the same time, by the teens and 20s, there were a few Jewish professors who ended up at the university. There was one in particular by the name of Louis Levine. It was a young economist, came here, and within his first few months, the Board of Regents asked him to do a study on the mines and taxation, to see what the taxation system was here in Montana. He came back and was pretty damning of the mining companies. As usual, they were not paying their fair share of taxes. Well, the mining companies just got in an uproar over this. And they applied all kinds of pressure to the university, to the Board of Regents, to get rid of this guy named Louis Levine. Louis Levine stuck to his ground. The faculty actually supported him and the administration, but the environment was just a toxic environment for him, and he ended up, after just 4 or 5 years, he left. And he ended up actually changing his name when he left here and became a writer. He wrote regularly for Atlantic Monthly and for various and more professional economic journals, and he changed his name to Louis Lorwin, L-O-R-W-N, but he was originally Louis Levine. There was another actually interesting fellow at the university he was the first PhD in journalism in the world, was a fellow by the name of Hausman, who ended up here at the University of Montana. He married a non-Jewish woman and wrote about it, and that was quite unusual in the 20s and 30s. He wrote a story that got quite wide coverage, and it was called "I Married a Gentile," and talked about that. One other professor I think is worth noting, who picked up on this theme. I read this poem called "The First Jew in Missoula," and one of the professors became one of the most famous professors at the universities back in the 50s and 60s, or until the early 60s, was a fellow by the name of Leslie Fiedler. Leslie Fiedler was known as a literary critic, and he wrote a book called The Last Jew in America, based upon something that took place here in Missoula, Montana. There had been a professor in the botany department by the name of Joe Kramer, Lithuanian born, and a fellow who was the last Jew. His friend, Sam Riven, had died back in about 1958, 59, somewhere in that period. Sam Riven, interesting story, came to Missoula after he had been a retail clerk in Hudson, New York. And the business that he worked for decided they needed to go west too and try to open up some businesses here. The first place they sent Sam Riven and family was Browning, Montana. They opened up a store on the reservation in about 1922, 23, somewhere in there. 3 kids, and they lasted about not even quite 2 years in Browning. It was just a rough place to be, as you can imagine, a family coming from New York. So Sam Riven moved his family to Butte. Butte was the big booming town. Still, they felt there were opportunities there. Their daughter, I think her name was Mary, had a little bit of a pulmonary and asthmatic condition. Butte was not good for that. The air in Butte was horrendous back in the teens and 20s. And so they decided they had to leave Butte. The next place they came was Missoula, Montana. So Sam Riven was actually the first, from what I can understand, person who really organized the Jewish community here. There weren't that many people, maybe a dozen families here in Missoula. But interestingly, they would get together for just a few major things. Passover is probably the one of the two, that and the New Year, the Jewish New Year. But the Passover gathering is a family thing, so it's all men and women. Holidays for more ritual things tend to be just men. And another interesting connection with Montana and the Jewish community, there were several Grand Masters of the Masons here in Montana who were Jewish. Even here in Missoula, Montana, when the men would get together to hold a little service, usually for the New Year's, they met at the Masonic Temple, the building which is right east of First Security on Broadway. There, almost at the intersection of Higgins and Broadway. First Security, just east of that building. That building is the Masonic building. And the Jewish men would gather once or twice a year, have a little something. So that went on through the 30s and 40s. There were several important people here in town. It was sort of mixed between the university and the businessmen. And I'll tell you one other interesting little story. There was a business on Broadway called Big Broadway. I don't know if any of you are old-time Missoulians, but Big Broadway was like a dry goods store, just a general store where I think the new Safeway is, or maybe that older Safeway, right there on Broadway. He sold everything from dishwashers to electronics to food to hardware, all this kind of thing. Henry Silver came to Missoula in about 1929 after he had been a businessman in Philadelphia and his business mysteriously burned down. He had to get out of town. He ended up in Missoula, Montana. He became an upstanding citizen here in Missoula. But there were some curious things about the circumstances of his leaving. The only reason I know this is pure serendipity. I grew up here in Missoula, but I was gone for over 38 years. Most of that time I was in North Carolina, and there was a professor at the University of North Carolina who was related to Henry Silver's wife, Bessie Silver, and he's the one who told me. He asked me when he found out that I was from Montana, Missoula specifically, he said, "Do you know the Silvers?" Well, I said, "Of course I know the Silvers." And he said, "Well, I'm related to Bessie," and he pointed me to a source about Henry Silver having to leave Philadelphia. I guess he had been he had a successful business there, but it was successful. I think it was done for purposes because of the stock market crash or something, and he tried to collect some money, and so he ended up in Missoula, took that money and came here to Missoula, Montana. So I told you about Sam Riven. The only other couple people I think I will mention is this Leslie Fiedler and family were actually quite important to the Jewish community here in Missoula. His wife ran the Sunday school. There was no building, there was no really formally organized Jewish community, but they ran the Sunday school, and that kind of helped bring people together. The community would gather for a few of the major holidays. Passover was always a community event here. Purim is kind of like the Jewish masquerade, Halloween-y kind of celebration. And then the New Year's. And many times when I was growing up, these celebrations, these gatherings took place at the Fiedler House, which is now the Unitarians. They're at the corner of McLeod and Higgins. This Joe Kramer was a very interesting fellow who had come. He was Lithuanian born, came to this country in the teens, wandered all around. He ended up at the University of Nebraska, studied under the probably original ecologist. There was a Professor Weaver at the University of Nebraska back in the 20s who taught, his field was ecology. Nobody heard the name or the expression ecology back in those days, but Joe Kramer studied with him. He had wandered around the West, worked in New Mexico, worked for the Forest Service, but he got a teaching position at the University of Montana back in the mid-30s. Joe Kramer, and I'll sort of finish this with the poem my dad wrote about Joe Kramer. He was cremated. He's not interred here, but after he retired from the university, what did he do? He went down to the Job Corps in Darby and was teaching kids remedial math and English. So Joe Kramer was quite an interesting fellow. So they dedicated a grove of pines for him. So a grove called Kramer Pines. High up in the Bitterroot Valley, you remember from John Denver's song, there's a grove of trees called Kramer Pines. Please hear me, it won't be long. Joe Kramer had come from Lithuania in his 20s, still a young lad. After many a trying experience, wound up here, for which we're all glad. He taught botany at the U in Missoula in his fiery and colorful way, and many a forestry student can remember him to this day. Well, there aren't many left who still remember Joe. Sorry for this side. Smoky Joe was the nickname they gave him. You can guess the reason why. Though often enough he made them laugh, there were times they wanted to cry. Over the whole range of science and human affairs, with his old world scholarly way, they learned about plants, but much, much more, with his humor and passion, they say. But when speaking of a particular tree, Joe's lecture was worthy of note. He'd declare his concern for our own yellow pine. I can almost recite it by rote. Some call it bull pine or jack pine, he said, but its authentic technical name is Pinus ponderosa, he would state, and it's garnered a wee bit of fame. He rolled his R's for all they were worth when pronouncing that mouthful in class, and said, if I'd had a daughter instead, Ponderosa'd be the name of that lass. As it comes to all, Smoky Joe passed away, his love for that tree undiminished. But Bob Steiner, his student, as I, a colleague and friend, thought his story was really unfinished. His students were working throughout the West, many in federal employ, so the USFS really came through, their action a source of much joy. For if you happen to visit Montana, out of Darby near Painted Rock Lake, you may come across that lovely pine grove, a memorial for Joe Kramer's sake. Joe was quite an interesting fellow. He actually was my tutor when I became a bar mitzvah. We're supposed to read Hebrew. I was a terrible student back in those days, but he helped tutor me to get me to that place. So those are some of the people, but now there is actually the organized Jewish community. We have a building, Har Shalom, which is across from the YMCA on Russell. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Emma Hanson Randolph. I was born March 3rd, 1877 at Fort Logan, Montana. I was the oldest of 8 children and grew up in the White Sulphur Springs area where my family was established in the ranching business. I attended the University of Montana and trained as a teacher with the first class of students admitted there. I met William Randolph while he worked at the assay office in White Sulphur Springs. His father managed a hotel that catered to the tourists seeking the comforts of the mineral springs that were located throughout the White Sulphur Springs area. William and I married in Missoula August 28, 1900. We journeyed to Lewiston, Idaho by wagon for our honeymoon. I continued to live in White Sulphur Springs and raise our 2 sons while William worked various jobs around the state. He was always restless and much of a daydreamer, constantly dreaming up the next big thing. He even traveled to Washington, D.C. for a patent on a mowing machine and was told that it was 5 different patents and that he would have to apply for each one. He never did go back and reapply. When I arrived in Missoula with our 2 sons, Keith and Robert, William had been working here as a laborer for nearly a year. William had wanted to buy some property on Higgins Avenue near where the Oxford is located now. I always dreamed of farming and raising my family, and so when I arrived, I insisted that we buy an 80-acre homestead just north of the city. This property is now known as the Moon Randolph Homestead, part of Missoula's North Hills open space. We purchased the homestead in 1907, and our 3rd son, Bill Jr., was born in 1911. I had desperately wanted a girl, and I dressed my youngest boy in rag curls and dresses until he was old enough to protest. The ranch included a 3-room cabin, a barn, and an orchard. William added to the barn so I could start a poultry business. I grew my poultry business from a few dozen to a few hundred chickens and had a net profit of $150 in 1909. Gardening takes water. We decided that another well was needed, and William dug a 30-foot well by hand closer to the house. William had plowed a garden below the orchard for kitchen vegetables. Every little thing brought in a little money, which added up. Every day, William would hitch up a team of horses to the cassava wagon, load it with whatever product was available that day, and go to Missoula to sell it. A normal load of goods would include such things as milk, cream, eggs, vegetables, and fruit. Potatoes sold for 1 cent per pound. The fruits and vegetables were stored in a root cellar on the property to be used as our own food or to be sold. As with all endeavors, there were lean times as well. In August that year, the cow's milk dried up. There wasn't any extra to sell. With chickens flourishing, that was a staple in our diet, but things such as beef and pork had to be bought. From 1910 to 1920, we survived through the dedicated exploitation of every possible income source we could think of. We bought the east 80 acres of the quarter section, which allowed additional pasture to expand a herd of dairy and beef cattle. Despite our every effort, things weren't entirely secure. In 1913, we were making enough to get by, but had yet to pay off debts, including the original price to George Moon for the ranch. My work ethic and William's creative ingenuity ensured a reasonable degree of comfort during the worst of times. During the Depression, it was well known that the Randolph Ranch always had room, coal, and something to eat for those in need. Although tractors had become a common sight on the farms around Missoula, my husband and son, Bill Jr., kept the old draft horses in their familiar rotations through the hay and grain fields. In 1944, we had 414 acres. We put up 80 tons of hay and had plenty of pasture for our 30 head of dairy cattle. We raised 40 early spring pullets and sold 50 dozen eggs a week. I raised a surplus of garden and potatoes and had a big crop of raspberries and cherries to sell. I took 800 pounds of honey from 10 beehives. By 1945, our farm had started a gradual decline in productivity. By 1946, I was still washing cream buckets, but could hardly haul wood for the cook stove or keep up with my household chores due to my health. I died January 3rd, 1956 of heart disease. My husband spent his last months tending to a sick cow and kept a diary of each day. He died in his sleep 5 months after I. Much of this story came from the great-grandchildren's memories of times on the homestead, as well as the book Butterflies and Railroad Ties, A History of a Montana Homestead by Caitlin DeSilvey. These books are still available on the Moon Randolph Homestead, and you can follow us on Facebook. Thank you for listening.
My name is Judge Wallace Clark. I was the first municipal court judge in Montana, right here in Missoula. And this is kind of the highlights of my life and my family's life. I was born in Sweetgrass, Montana in 1916. That's right on the Canadian border. I was born within a couple hundred feet of the Canadian border. I grew up in Sweetgrass and Shelby, living the good life, riding horses and having fun on the High Line. My father was Othniel D. Clark. He was the sheriff of Toole County, and later on when he died he was the U.S. Deputy Marshal out of Great Falls. The Clarks came from Kentucky in the late 1880s to Montana and settled up there. There's still Clarks up in the Sweetgrass Hills. My mother, Agnes Shane Clark, came to Montana via Canada, originally from Northern Ireland. And she was about 4'10" and tough as nails right up until the day she died. She kept everybody in control. And I attended school in Shelby. I graduated from the Shelby High School. I went to the University of Montana. During the summers at university, I worked as a customs official up on the border, the Canadian border. I graduated from the university in 1940, and in September of 1940, I enlisted in the Montana National Guard. My mother was proud to be an American and new to the country and thought her sons ought to serve right away. In May of 1941, I joined the regular Army and received an officer's commission. Obviously, Pearl Harbor happened December 7th, 1941. We went to war full on. I went to the European theater, starting off with the North African campaign, Sicily, Italy, and then southern France. I was an infantryman and later assigned to a medical battalion. After the war, I was back here in Missoula to continue my education. I wanted to go to law school. I met my wife, Mary Beth, who's usually right as I started off, at a church social. I took her out. I took her out on a nice picnic. I laid it all out. She didn't have to lift a finger. I know that because I've heard this over and over again, because apparently after I married her, that never happened again. But she was a Missoula girl. Her grandfather brought that side of the family out to Missoula in the late 1880s with the Northern Pacific Railroad. He was a bridge and building engineer for the railroad. His wife, Emily, followed him along the railroad camps, managing the meals for the camp workers. He was the one who bought the house that we still have, that has raised 5 generations of us downtown, and he bought that in 1905. We're standing right at the family plot. This is my wife's family's plot here. Joshua Fleming was my wife's grandfather. His wife, Emily, they had a daughter, Lillian. Lillian married a doctor, Dr. Tony, who I have been told repeatedly by my mother-in-law that he was a kind and gentle man from Indiana. That usually would come out to show contrast, apparently, towards me. But he died, unfortunately, young. He died very young. He was caring for influenza patients here in Missoula during the influenza epidemic. Anyway, once we were married, we raised 3 children. I graduated from law school in '47. I wanted to be a lawyer obviously, but I also wanted to be in the military. The Army at that time didn't have positions open for me, but the Air Force said they'd let me be a lawyer, and so I joined the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the U.S. Air Force, and for those that don't know, that's when it was started. It used to be the Army Air Corps, and then it became the U.S. Air Force. I served with the Air Force from 47 till 63. I traveled around the world. I took my family most places, including my mother-in-law, who was a widow, and she traveled with us and lived with us until she died. I was in Japan, Ankara, Turkey, and my last posting was at the Pentagon. During the Turkey years, I was there from 57 to 59. I thought it'd be fun to entertain the troops, so I decided we ought to have a Montana rodeo. So I rounded up some livestock and horses and enough guys that could ride horses, or at least thought they could ride horses, and we put on a rodeo for the guys, for the troops. And this is a real rodeo. We had bucking broncos and roping expeditions, and I mean, it was the full deal in the middle of Ankara, Turkey. While there, obviously I was with the JAG Corps, and one of my things that I took care of was sometimes the servicemen would get in trouble with the Turkish authorities and be arrested. Well, I would go down there and get them out as soon as I could. And if I couldn't get them out that day, if they had to stay overnight in a Turkish jail, I stayed with them outside the cell. And the reason I did that is because if an officer was present, the Turks wouldn't abuse the servicemen. When I retired from the military, we came back to Missoula. I retired, I had cataracts. And back then, you have cataract surgery, they'd sandbag your head for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. And I mean, you couldn't move. It was nothing like it is now. But anyway, I never trusted myself to drive again. So that's why you saw me walking around town for the rest of my life. I was an old infantryman, so walking was no big deal, and I walked around. My wife, Mary Beth, said it wasn't that I couldn't see, it was because I liked to be chauffeured by her. Once I got back to town, I started a private law practice. I also worked for the Missoula County Attorney's Office for a short while. I ran for county coroner in the 60s. I didn't get elected to that. I would actually later in 1980 run for the Montana Supreme Court. I was defeated in that. While in the 60s, I was with my friend John Toole, and John Toole would be a future mayor of Missoula. We were walking by the courthouse, and we saw these records, county records, that were in a dumpster, and it must have been from an office remodel or something. And I'm a big lover of history. I read all the time, and Montana history especially, and that just shocked me. So John and I took turns guarding that dumpster so it didn't get taken away, and then we took turns running in and trying to call somebody that had a pickup. Well, once we found somebody with a pickup, we climbed in the dumpster and dug the records out, took them over to the university, and copies of them are still there at the Mansfield Library. In '67, I was elected to police judge, and that was before municipal court. Police judge was like the city traffic judge. The city police department had a row of jail cells in the police department, kind of temporary jail cells. The county still ran the sheriff's office ran the real jail on the 4th floor of the courthouse, but the city would put temporary prisoners in these cells. I would get up in the middle of the night and walk down there unannounced and just check on the prisoners. And I did that because I wanted the prisoners to show up in my court looking the same as they did when they went into the jail. And unfortunately, then, as now, sometimes the wrong people are allowed to wear a badge, and that was my way to keep people on their toes. Mary Beth always thought that she'd get a call in the middle of the night because I was accidentally run over by a police car on the way home. In April of '77, I was elected as the first municipal court judge in Montana. Missoula was the first city to have one. The previous legislative session enacted that. I served as a municipal court judge from '77 until '89, when I was defeated by Judge Don Loudon. He was a city attorney for years. During these municipal court years is when most of the stories came about of my idea of justice and my interpretation of the law. And I'm stubborn, and I don't mind sharing my opinion about that. Some people didn't like it and other people did like it. But my point was, I was a judge. Judges are there to look at the case and make their own determination. Every case is different. If we didn't need a judge, we could just use a matrix system. You do this, I look down the list, you get a fine, you get jail time. That's the way that's not how it is. We have judges for a reason. The law is interpreted. Now people say, well, that's not just. Justice is everybody gets the same penalty. For example, a stop sign violation. Everybody gets a $50 fine. I can understand part of that argument, that being just. Justice across the board. The counter argument to that is, if you make $200,000 a year, a $50 fine is a pittance to you. But if she is a single working mother raising 2 kids, $50 could mean food on the table or not food on the table. So, what is fair? What is just? Every case is different. One of the times when justice comes out in my court more strictly than others is when I have people in front of me that fought with the police. And sometimes it surprises them when they get the stiff penalties. And I tell them, if you fight with the police out there on the street, you're going to get stiff penalties in here because I have to do my job in here. If I don't do my job in here, they might start doing my job on the street, and we don't want that. An example of one of the cases that came before me was a lady brought in on shoplifting, and she pled guilty, and I asked her, why are you here? What happened? And she said, well, I just moved from Spokane and with my boyfriend, and I got 2 kids. And my boyfriend left us, and he took a lot of the stuff. And it's getting cold, and the stuff I stole, Judge, was clothes for the kids. So I called the city officer in, and I said, what's on the list? What was stolen? And he said, yeah, it was kids' clothes. I said, okay, well, you pled guilty, and I'm going to give you a deferred sentence. You stay out of trouble for 6 months, this doesn't go on your record. I told the city officer, go over to the store, take that stuff back, and buy the exact same stuff. I'll buy it. And this lady will pay me back when she can. This is a loan. When you get on your feet, you pay me back. Well, the neat thing is, about a year later, she came back into my court, and she paid every penny back. And I said, thanks, but you've done enough. And I slid it back to her, and she said, nope, it was a loan. You gave me a loan, I appreciate it. Here's the money back. I said, yep, it was a loan, but now it's a gift. I never had a lot of money in my pocket, but when I did, if somebody needed a hand, I'd walk them over to the Hamburger Ace and buy them a hamburger and a Coke. I didn't see my court as a generating arm, a revenue generating arm of the city. That upset a lot of city officials because it's a heck of a revenue generating arm if you let it be. But I didn't see that. I was a public servant, not a revenue agent. And so I had creative sentences, and I had some fines, but some people say I didn't have enough fines, and I don't care. If they didn't like my form of justice, I'd remind them that this is a court of record, which means there's transcripts, there's tapes, and you can appeal this court. You can appeal this court all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. It's about 2,000 miles east, and by the time your case gets there, I'll be dead. Again, I stayed in office until I was defeated by Judge Loudon, who was a city attorney for years. In August of '88, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and in November of 1990, I died at home, in the family home, surrounded by family, which is not a bad way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Garnet, Ghost Town. My name is Lena, and I was born in 1872 in Sweden, and I came over to America, and I went to a dinner party and met this man, and he's a miner, and I ended up at the Garnet. and I lived there for a long time. But, yeah, well, yes, I know. We're best friends, you know. This is Anna Dahlberg. But we kind of go chippy back and forth once in a while.
We're almost like a married couple.
Well, we started out in Garnet, and my husband was mining, and then we went over to Coloma, and then we went to Idaho, and we came back. But each town that I lived in, I ended up having a baby. After 6 babies, I said, that's it, I'm not moving anymore, I don't want any more kids. So he agreed to that, didn't he, Anna?
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we ended up in the McDonald house. No, we were in the Adams house, weren't we?
You were in the Adams
Oh,
house.
yes, I always forget. It depends upon which year it was. But we ended up in the Adams house, and he ended up as the postmaster in Garnet. Now, Garnet, you know, at that time was called Mitchell first, and then it ended up Garnet. But it was Garnet, wasn't it?
Yes.
Because it had to only be 1 syllable, because we couldn't get a post office because Mitchell was 2. So anyway, I talk too much, and Anna here, she likes to do a little bit once in a while. So,
Well, my name is Anna Dahlberg. I came to Garnet in 1898 as a single woman. My maiden name is Lindell. And I'm a trained baker, and I heard that there were jobs available in these mining camps. So I came on the train, got to Bearmouth. There's a whole group of us on the train, and that stage did not wait for us. So as a group, we walked all the way up China Grade. And we got to Garnet at 5 o'clock in the morning. Now, you can imagine after that walk, we were hungry, we were tired. But there was a middle of a shift change, and I went right to the Wells Hotel and got hired immediately as a baker. And but because the food was already cooked, I waited tables, but I did get fed. And that was always good. But
just imagine those young people. You were pretty young, weren't you?
I was 27. I was actually considered an old maid at that point. But I did meet my husband up at Garnet, and a year later we got married. His name is Gus Dahlberg. He worked for Sam Ritchie up at Nancy Hanks, and when we got married, he decided to be his own boss and do his own mining. And he remained friends with Sam, and they went in and bought the water system up at Garnet. They ran that together, and
It's pretty darn neat.
so we actually did good. We retired. Well, we left Garnet in 1913. Can't call it retired.
I stayed there a lot longer.
You stayed there a lot longer.
I know.
But we moved to Bearmouth, where we did a ranch.
Now, I had a little girl. I had 6 children, of course, but I had a little girl named Margaret. And Margaret had spina bifida, and she lived to be 25 years old. But the miners were so good that they built her a little wheelchair, and she used to go all over town, and everybody loved her because she had blonde, curly hair and big blue eyes. And every time they would see her, she'd be smiling. If you look at a lot of pictures from years ago, you're going to see this little tiny girl posted, you know, sitting on somebody's lap or sitting on the front of the school. And she did really very, very good.
She was very well loved up there.
We had a lot of buildings up there. We had 13 taverns. Can you imagine 13 saloons? And this was a very family-oriented town. In fact, at the Kelly Saloon, in the back, you could get in the back door. We'd go upstairs, all of us, and we would sit around up there, and Mrs. Kelly would sneak downstairs and get us pitchers of beer, and we drank, wouldn't we? Oh my gosh!
Nobody was supposed to know that.
I'm not going to tell, are you?
Okay, I won't. Well, I guess it doesn't matter for us anymore, does it?
Nah, we've been floating around here. I'm 140 years old today. Can you imagine? I mean, you know, my hair hasn't even turned gray yet. Amazing what you can do with a bottle, isn't it? It was a wonderful town to live in. We had great people. We had a lot of friends. The miners worked very, very hard. And if you look at all the pictures, they were very thin, but that doesn't mean that they were underfed. We had moose and elk and deer, and they'd keep them outside their back door and frozen and cut off the meat when they needed it cut off. But it was a fun time also. But we didn't have a bank, we didn't have a church, and we did not have a hospital. But we had the Union Hall. Now, people didn't want to be buried there because it wasn't consecrated ground. So we're all buried here at this beautiful Missoula Cemetery. Do you see this beautiful cemetery with all the leaves falling down and the color, and it's so pretty? Now, wouldn't you want to be buried here with us? We'd have a good time here, don't we?
We do have
We do. Does anybody have any questions?
Did anyone make money?
Oh, yes. Yes,
Husband make money?
absolutely. They took in its heyday, Garnet took in about 5 ton, was $17 an ounce at that time compared to $1,300 an ounce now. But that was a lot of money at the time. We lived very well, we had beautiful clothes. Don't we look smashed? Yes. I thought we looked pretty good. But we did have everything that you can imagine. The Davy store had candies, and we had a candy shop, a sweet shop, and there was a barber shop. There isn't much that we didn't have, but I said it was family. Now the Union Hall is where we had all of our dances, we had our marriages, we had the christenings there, and there was a place called Dublin Gulch. Lots of Irish, Catholic Irish, so they would bring in a priest once a month, yes, and oh yeah, we had those, you're the baker, we had a lot of weddings up there.
We had a lot of weddings.
Can you tell them where they stayed?
Well, they would have stayed at the Wells.
And you cook for them, right?
I cooked for them, yes. We saw a lot of people.
Also, Frank Davies happened to have a place, he called it the honeymoon cabin. And at the honeymoon cabin, they could get married and then they could live in the cabin for free until their house was built. But if Anna got married 2 weeks after I got married, then she could boot me out and she could get to stay there, and so then I'd have to find another place.
Yes.
Now, everybody saw the dedication today that we did for Frank Davy. Frank Davy owned the honeymoon cabin, and even after he passed away, his taxes paid for that so that people could still maintain there.
Yeah. The mining wasn't the only way to earn money in Garnet because, well, Frank got very wealthy.
Yes.
Just by having a store, because things were expensive in the mining towns. But he had enough money that in 1913 he went back to England to see his family, and he actually came back from Liverpool on the Lusitania and his own cabin.
The kids didn't like him though, did they? No. Oh man, you should have seen them. They even put the wagon on top of the building one night. Hung him in effigy, and yet he still gave him candy all the time. They had a really, really good time. Hello, are you coming to see the ghosts today? Yeah. Great, nice to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? We have lots of stories, but I didn't know if anybody had specific. Has everybody been up to the Garnet Ghost Town? Have you? Oh, thank you very much for coming up to see us. Now, when you hear the music in the Kelly's Saloon, that's her and I having a really good time over there. They are still mining up above the Garnet Ghost Town. And it is the old Nancy Hanks mine, and they are still mining. There are a lot of old mines around.
Yes.
Oh, you know what? Did you ever hear about our little Warren's Park? Warren's Park, it's a little bit of a hike to get to it, but there was a man named Mr. Warren, and he just had such a hard time because the kids didn't have a place to play. So he went, it's about 1.5 miles up the mountain, it's over by Anderson Hill, and he built swings and places for the kids to play so they could go out there and they could play and they didn't have to be in the hustle bustle of all the mines. Isn't that a wonderful thing to do? It is. Yeah. Well, we have a sheriff over here. Sheriff, come on over here. Sheriff Cole.
Oh, yes.
Hey, Mr. Sheriff.
Okay. Res Sheriff John Cole, born in 1860, moved to Garnet in 1900. and I had a newspaper that I did advertising, and they say my paper was very political, which I don't know what that meant back in the early 1900s. But so I started out as a newspaper, having my own newspaper, and I charged the people for any articles that was in it, and I got paid in gold for that. Then I'm pretty sure, I haven't found out for sure, but I think I self-appointed myself as sheriff, because having 13 bars, you know, we figured we were going to have problems. Well, we didn't. I arrested one person and one dog.
It wasn't us, was it? No, it wasn't us.
But Garnet was not an average boom town. The difference was that the people that came there either had families, started families, and so it was very family oriented. So there was a lack of crime. Therefore, being a lack of crime, I left in 1910, I think. Really?
Oh, I don't know. I was probably too young at the
okay.
time.
Well, yeah, she was too young. She doesn't remember me. But anyways, I moved to Phillipsburg and had a paper there for a while, then moved to Anaconda and did a newspaper there, and then passed away of poor health.
That's because you're always working.
It's because I was always working. So.
Thank you. Any questions? Are we good to go? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You didn't get in here for us.
Thank you for coming today. I'm here representing Jerry Daniels. Jerry Daniels grew up in the Helmville, Ovando area, not too far from here, and moved to Missoula with his family when high school started, because there wasn't a high school up in that area. He graduated from Missoula County High School, and during his, I think it was his senior year, maybe it was his junior year. Anyway, he was just barely 17 when he became a Missoula smoke jumper. So as far as we know, he was the youngest person, since he was just barely beyond 16 years old, to become a smoke jumper here. Two of his older brothers had been smoke jumpers before him, and 2 years later, because he started in '58, 2 years later, in 1960, just as the Vietnam War was starting to percolate, it was 1960, and the CIA sent recruiters out to the smoke jumper base in Missoula and in McCall, Idaho, because they were looking for young men with certain skills. Those who knew parachutes, knew cargo, knew how to kick cargo, how to rig cargo, knew airplanes, knew how to jump, and the smoke jumpers knew all of that and how to survive in rough terrain. So Jerry, along with a good number of other smoke jumpers out of these two bases, were very quietly recruited by the CIA. They were all single, they were all young, and they all thought an adventure overseas sounded pretty interesting. They didn't really know where they were going. They suspected it might be Southeast Asia, and sure enough, that is where they ended up. They all were also very good at keeping their mouths shut. So some of them would jump here during fire season and then go back overseas again. They started out as cargo kickers for Air America, which was a CIA proprietary airline. It means owned and operated by the CIA. Flying out of the bases in Udon, Thailand, and some of the other bases in Thailand. Basically, they were cargo kickers dropping into these very remote areas of Laos, where there was not a big enough airstrip for anybody to land, and so they were dropping in that. Some of the smoke jumpers stayed with cargo kicking, and Jerry was one of the few that decided that he really liked it overseas, really enjoyed Southeast Asia, and he was interested in working more on the ground with the people. So he talked to the agency about that and was told, okay, he could become a junior case officer, but in order to move up in the organization, he would need to come back and take some more classes and get a college degree. So for the next several years, off and on, he came back to the University of Montana in Missoula and was studying here. He'd save his money, he'd come back, he'd do a semester, he'd go back overseas. It was somewhat random the way he got through college, but he did graduate in 1969 and became a full senior CIA case officer. He had been working on the ground in Laos that whole time, but now he moved into the heartland, which was the secret air base that was at Longchang, Laos, in northern Laos. That was the site where General Vang Pao was stationed, and eventually he became the personal case officer and advisor, American advisor to General Vang Pao. He was there through the very difficult war years. He worked very closely with the Hmong soldiers who were all fighting on behalf of the Lao government, but with the same agenda as the U.S. government. Because the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Laos, a lot of what they did was to stop the North Vietnamese coming into South Vietnam. And Jerry was heavily involved with all those soldiers. They took a real beating in Laos. So while the war in Vietnam was very public and all of us knew about it on the television, in the newspapers, the war in Laos was secret. It was run only by the CIA, and there were no, or very, very few American military that were on the ground, but there were these CIA case officer advisors that were working very quietly throughout the whole country with the local indigenous troops that were there. In 1975, Saigon fell at the end of April, and 2 weeks after that, there was this massive air evacuation from Saigon. 2 weeks after that, Jerry was the only American left on the ground in northern Laos. He was the one who orchestrated and organized a secret, because everything was secret in Laos, air evacuation of General Vang Pao and about 2,500 Hmong officers, soldiers, and their families from Longchang, Laos to northern Thailand. That was the beginning of the refugee movement. There were already tanks up on the ridgeline. It was too dangerous to continue any longer. So many, many Hmong over the next 10 years were filtering out of Laos that had been involved during the secret war in Laos. Because of that, once Jerry was out of Laos, and he was personally responsible for getting General Vang Pao out. It was either they were both going to die or they were both going to survive. There was no way he was leaving without the general. And he was successful, obviously. General Vang Pao in 1975 did come to the U.S. and ended up in the Bitterroot Valley on a farm down there. Jerry went back to Thailand and was on loan to the State Department from the CIA because he was the only one who had been working with the Hmong consistently since 1960. He knew the battles, he knew the commanders, he had all kinds of tricky questions that he could ask those soldiers to figure out who was a bona fide soldier that had worked on as a pro-American troops, you know. Anyway, So he did the interviews with the refugees, the Hmong refugees that were in Thailand. That continued for another 8 years. And he was very, very good at that job. He was, by 1982, he was starting to think about coming back to Missoula, where he had lots of friends, some of whom have shown up today, and family, and some of his Hmong friends were here also. He was thinking about that quite seriously, and in end of April 1982, a body was found in his apartment in Bangkok. It was not recognizable. It was quite disfigured, not recognizable. And the U.S. Embassy called the local Thai police department to come and pick up the body. This is odd, I think, because Jerry had worked for the CIA. He was working probably still for the CIA and officially for the State Department. He was a U.S. Embassy employee. He was an American citizen. And why the embassy called the Thai police department to handle the investigation of his death strikes me as questionable. The paperwork that the Thai provided was done very quickly. It was sent back to the embassy. Everything was good. Everything was matched. This was Jerry. A body was put into a casket, and that casket was permanently sealed, never to be opened. And then it was shipped here to Missoula. And here we are today. That casket was not opened. Jerry had worked with the Hmong community, the Hmong soldiers, for so many years, both in Laos and in Thailand, that when the casket arrived here, he was extremely honored by the Hmong community. They had a traditional 3-day Hmong funeral ceremony for him here in Missoula. And the casket went into the ground as is. It was not opened because Jerry's mother said, no, if the government wants us to keep it closed, we will do that. But questions continue. He led a very interesting and adventuresome life, and maybe some of you read the book reviews that have been in the Missoulian this summer. So I wrote a biography of him that talks both about his life and about the Hmong funeral ceremony, which is long and interesting, I think. And so I have a few of those here today. But if there are questions, I will do my best to answer them.
I have a question.
Yes.
That picture that's on the... What is that?
This is as close as they could do because nobody had a photograph. This is the Longcheng Airport, the secret CIA base. There's the runway. This is the general's house and where the CIA was located up there. He loved hunting, so these are actually, Canada goose over there. That has nothing to do with Laos. And this says Longcheng in Lao script. Mr. Hogg was his radio code name, and it was supposed to be Hogue from Ferret Hogue, which is a whole family story that we won't get into, but the Hmong couldn't say Hogue, they could only say Hogg, and so he said, okay, that works for me, I'll be Mr. Hogg. And so they called him Mr. Jerry or Mr. Hogg the whole time he was working with them.
And you may have started with this, but how did you come to be interested in him?
Because how did I become interested in him? I started working with Vietnamese refugees in California immediately after the fall of Saigon, and about a year later the very first Hmong were coming in, and I really liked them. I knew they said they were from Laos, but I knew that couldn't be true, because what did Laos have to do with the Vietnam War? And then, of course, eventually I found out, yes, it was a secret war that went on in Laos.
So, were his remains ever positively identified?
Were his remains positively identified? Only by the Thai Police Department. They were positively identified. No, in other words. The autopsy report that was sent back to the family, 4 pages long with every single line blacked out.
That's him right there.
And this is Dan.
He couldn't eat that much.
This is Jerry's brother, and he has another story to tell.
Well, before this thing here is Operation Cold Feet. This happened in '82. The jumpers and CIA guys in Marana, Arizona developed this way of, and if you've seen John Wayne's Green Berets, they send up a balloon, which is back here, and this B-17 or whatever B number it is has a big V on the front of it. They developed this in Arizona to pick up our astronauts out of the ocean. And it gets down to the V, turns like this, turns a couple of hooks, and it's on a nylon line that's 300 feet long. And it stretches so far that it lays right on the belly of the plane. And the winch man down here, which Jerry was the winch man, then they'd reel him up. They developed this for those astronauts, and our wise government said, show these guys what you can do. They said, well, it's not developed all the way. You show them what to do. He said, it's too windy, I don't know what'll happen. Not just Jerry, but the whole crew. And most of them were smoke jumpers. And so they set up a dummy and came by, snapped this guy up, and he whammed into some trees and fences and some bleachers. And these astronauts says, we don't want to get picked up by that thing. So, to my knowledge, this operation here, which was in the Arctic, picking up Russian intel, that's a Russian camp that's down here. Their ice runway was starting to collapse with the pressure crack. They told them to get out, so the Russians got out. And there was left a lot of intel. Of course, everybody says it was weather intel that they were picking, but it was probably listening to our submarines running in what directions and all that kind of stuff. So they dropped 2 really smart guys from the Navy, admirals. I don't think they were admirals, but Leshak, who was on that book down there, was there, and they picked up worked on them for 2 days getting all this stuff. There was pictures of these Russians' families, their food, their cigarettes, their alcohol was still at this place when they picked it all up. And these guys went through quite a stories, and it was really low visibility with the fog and in clouds, and these guys here didn't know where they were, so they decided to go up and take a shot with the sun, because they're so close to the North Pole that their compasses didn't make any difference. They got up and they were 8 miles from Russia, which is not a pleasant thing to be when you're in a Cold War with Russia. But they got these guys out, and this is, well, that was in '62, and he died in '82, so he was just 21 years old when he and that bunch of guys that he was with that developed this thing here, that happened. And my wife and I were flown back, my brother and his daughter were flown back to the CIA to receive a posthumously awarded medal for all these guys. Some of their names are on the bottom. One of the pilots lives down in Corvallis. And the guy in the nose of the plane, you can just see a little smudge there. He lives up in Ovando half the year. The other half is in Texas. And so they're still around, but those guys of that era were a different brand of people. Just like we don't fight fires nowadays like we did then. They'd see a fire, they'd drop 2 or 3 jumpers on it and kill the fire within a day or so. Now they let it burn for a while, and then they have a different way of going about it. Now they're worried more about human life and buildings, which is just a different way of fighting the fires. But these guys, they were sent back there. They had to backpack their stuff out. They were in good shape, and they had to think for themselves. I mean, if somebody got hurt, they had to take care of them, get them out of there. So that's why they used Jerry and these other jumpers that were of that in the 50s era in Laos, and because they could think and make things work like a good old rancher or farmer. You couldn't go to town every day. You fixed it, or you made something to make that piece of machinery work. Is there any questions on that? Don't feel afraid to ask any kind of a question you want. Whether he's in that hole or not, I don't know. They say that there was something like 92% carbon monoxide in his blood. My older brother Jack, and it really is Jack Daniels, there's just no apostrophe down there. He's a doctor of physiology, and he tested high altitude runners for their use of oxygen and how much carbon monoxide they emit, and they used to black each other out, and they'd black out at about 50% carbon monoxide in their blood. Now they're talking 42% more. That guy should have blacked out if he had 92%. How did he get that high? Is it some deal that they said, well, we'll just put that down and nobody will ever check? Of course, now you couldn't find out. So that is one of the Jack is looking into right now, about the possibility that there is a large discrepancy there. Whether we dig him up, we don't know.
Many questions, and yes, we don't have, it's a lot of things we don't have answers for, but we'll start again at the beginning in a couple of minutes if there are no more questions. Feel free to mill around.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Welcome. I'm glad you're here this afternoon. I am Josephine Graf Stepanzoff. I was born in Bavaria in 1905, and I was born into a family who were good business people, and they had very successful business in Bavaria. But my father was also very aware of the fact that World War I was imminent, and that our future would be in grave danger if we stayed. And so he packed us up and he moved us to Bozeman, Montana, where we established the Bonton Bakery. We established a Bonton Bakery in Bozeman, and one in Billings, and one in Missoula. And there was also a flour mill in Bozeman at that time to supply the flour that was needed for the bakery. We, at that time, we would do about 600 loaves of bread a day and all sorts of other things that went with owning a bakery, and it was a very successful and wonderful business, and I had a great childhood growing up there. When it came time for me to go to college, I decided that I would go to the University of Montana. Language and writing was always a passion of mine, and so I chose the University of Montana because they had a wonderful English department, and I wanted to come here and study with them. And so I came here and I met a dashing young Russian man, very, very handsome young Russian man, and we fell in love, and we as we dated at the University of Montana, he was instrumental in establishing the International Club, and I helped him with this. When Alex came to Montana, he had originally come from Russia to California, and in California he was tending to run around with friends that were Russian and speak Russian all the time, and he said to one of his advisors, I need to go to a school where I'm the only Russian-speaking person. So the professor said to him, well, I got a deal for you. So he sent him to the University of Montana, where he was the first international exchange student there. And he, of course, did learn to speak English being here. Alex participated in a lot of musical things in his native Russia. And when he came to the United States, it was no different. He continued with all of that. And he also continued with that at the University of Montana, where I continued with my writing. I won a lot of awards for my writing, and I was published in a lot of literary magazines. And I'll read one of these poems for you right now. I tended to write about life. I wrote about death. I wrote about living and dying. I wrote about trouble and tragedy and just the real side of life. This particular poem that I wrote is called Rest Home. Sitting alone by a window, we found her at last, our virtues, our freshness, and the results of our shopping. We piled them all in her lap. She turned from watching outside, and she listened and nodded and smiled and agreed, trying hard to be glad for our coming. But her glances kept wandering to the winter birds hopping and chirping and pecking. She tried to look sad at our going, but she was already gone with the sparrows outside. So that's entitled Rest Home. After I graduated from the University of Montana, Alex graduated the year before me in 1929 and moved to New York City to work for Chase Manhattan Bank. I joined him in 1930, and we were married in New York. When Alex went to work for the bank, he walked in and he saw the sign on the door, and it said banking hours 10 to 2. So he thought, well, that's going to be great. I'll be able to get home at a decent hour, because he had to take the train home. And so he thought that would be just fine. Well, as it turned out, he usually ended up taking that 11:30 p.m. train home. So his job was not what was considered banking hours. But we loved living in New York City because we both liked all sorts of things, like the culture and the music and the drama and all of the arts and things that we got to experience. It was wonderful for us to be there. And we also made a number of trips to Europe. We loved to sail, to get on the big ocean liners and go to Europe and experience the things that we'd grown up around in both of our childhoods. And then we'd come back to the United States, and we also loved being here. In 1933, my father called and offered Alex the opportunity to run the Bonton Bakery in Missoula. So we moved back to Missoula, and when we left, Alex was interviewed, and they said to him, how can you leave a job at Chase Manhattan and go to Missoula, Montana? And he said, well, it's just going from one kind of dough to the other kind of dough. So he always had such a great sense of humor, and we loved visiting with each other. We both enjoyed visiting and talking about things and talking about the state of the world and all sorts of things like that. And because we traveled so much, we knew so many things and had so many varied interests. Alex was invited to join the city band, or to direct the city band, and he did that for over 50 years. And I sat in the front row in my lawn chair, sitting there watching the city band play. One of my favorite things was that the band members would talk about was when Alex wanted there to be more low brass or trombone, he would say, I want to more rumpa, rumpa, rumpa. And of course, band members would give him more rumpa, rumpa, rumpa. So we enjoyed that very much, and I spent every evening there. The first band show was actually over by where the city hall is now, and it was the bandstand, and they had the concerts there. And so we'd go there for years, and then Alex was so proud of the fact, and so was I, that Missoula had come together and built that beautiful band shell over at Bonner Park. We were thrilled for many, many years to be able to go there and to perform and to lead the community in music. Our beautiful daughter Allegra was born here in Missoula and went to school here in Missoula, and in 1966, Alex, they sold the Bonton Bakery to Continental Bakeries, and Alex would travel all around the state, and he would check on the things for the bakery, and I would stay home and write, and I would and be with Allegra. In 1991, I was starting to not feel all that great, actually before 91, but I was starting to not feel all that great, and so we decided that this was the time that we should move to California and be with our daughter. So we packed up our belongings, sold everything in our lovely house that was right across from the University of Montana, sold that, left our wonderful neighbors and the community where we had summer ice cream socials and all of that kind of thing. We left that and went to California. And I died in California in 1993. Alex brought me back to be buried here, and he came where family and friends had our last service. Alex lived a number of years longer and died in California, where he is, where Alex remains are still. So, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right, talking about the history of the Wilma Theater, the long, colorful, sometimes sordid history of the Wilma Theater. Who knows anything about the Wilma Theater? Nothing at all? You must know where it is, right? That crazy kind of trapezoidal shaped building sitting right down on the corner there? Sure. Built in 1921 by this fella, William A. Simmons, in honor of that woman, Edna Wilma, who later became Edna Wilma Simmons. They met in 1909. She and her sister were a very popular vaudeville duo, the Wilma sisters. They used to sing and dance and do other types of performance in light opera, little you know, classic productions like The Chocolate Soldier, you know, that you've probably heard of a bunch. Not really. She didn't really ever make it big in vaudeville, but she was a fantastic businessman, as we will find out, or businesswoman. The story of the Wilma Theater begins with this love story, but it begins a little bit further back with this fella, Billy Simmons, who built it for his wife. He was born in Kansas in 1864. When he was 14 years old, his father died in a logging accident. He was guiding a big boom of logs down a river in Kansas when he slipped in and drowned, leaving Billy Simmons at age 14, the head of the household that included 6 kids and his widowed mother. He started working to make ends meet, or to help the family make ends meet, at a shop that built kinds of cabinetry, cupboards, woodworking things, coffins. And he worked there for about I think for somewhat less than a year. Didn't get the raise he wanted, so he gave his notice and marched across the street to work for a different guy who also did cabinetry and cupboards and made coffins. But evidently, I think that this guy was a much better boss. He's the kind of boss who we all sort of want to have, because he would go home for a long lunch. He was German. He would go home for a big long lunch with his family, have a couple of beers, greasy, big meal, and come back to his shop and spend the rest of the afternoon sleeping in one of the coffins. So he left 15-year-old Billy to do most of the work of running the business, and Billy proved to be pretty good at running businesses. He saved up some money, and with some more, I think $1,000 that he got basically credit for his father's gold watch, he went into business selling coffee and pancakes to railroad men in Cherryvale, Kansas, where he was growing up. And he was fantastically successful at that too. After a couple years, he was able to sell his share in that business for many, many times what he'd put into it. He took those proceeds and rented the second floor of, I think, a disused apartment building in Kansas, bought a bunch of pairs of roller skates and opened a roller skating rink. This is in 1881. An 1881 roller skating rink. I think that is just fantastic. I can't imagine the music was the same though. I always think about Funky Town and like the theme from Dukes of Hazzard when I'm roller skating, that kind of stuff. I don't know what they would have done. Probably had a live orchestra or like chamber music or something like that. In any case, when the thrill of roller skating wore off, which I know is a little bit hard to believe, he came up to Montana from Kansas. He followed a friend of his who had already set himself up here and said, "Hey, it's great, man. Come check it out." So he came up here, and almost immediately he started cooking this scheme to put together the biggest Wild West show that he could conceive of. Remember what Wild West shows are? Buffalo Bill, Calamity Jane, bison, tricks, shooting tricks, ponies. He wanted to have the Wild West show to end all Wild West shows. He wanted a show so big that no tent could possibly contain it. The show that he had in mind had hundreds of costumed participants. Cowboys, Indians, a herd of bison, who are extremely difficult to get off and on the trains, by the way. You know, cows apparently like are more inclined to load themselves into cattle cars than bison. Go figure. And another attraction of this show was said to be a mountain lion that was trained to ride a pony. I would pay top dollar to see that today. In fact, if that was going on right now, so long, suckers! I'm gonna go watch a mountain lion riding a pony. Well, it didn't quite work out for him in his big Wild West show. He was taking the show on the road east through the Midwest, and the first stop was in Butte, where on the night of July 5th, 1887, I believe, it snowed 5 inches. Kind of put that big outdoor show out of business. And I guess the production was similarly dogged by bad weather, tornadoes, locusts, rivers running blood, frogs falling from the sky, all of these perils as it made its way westward to the point where he just decided that enough was enough with the Wild West show. But in the meantime, he'd also started diversifying his holdings in a much more sensible way. He owned a lot of buildings. He was starting to buy theaters. He was starting to take an interest in touring groups, vaudeville groups and things like that. So he was actually like a pretty well-rounded, integrated businessman. Had a lot of holdings in Portland, Oregon, had a lot of property in Wallace, Idaho, and had a lot of property in Missoula, Montana. Didn't have himself a young lady to share it all with. So according to the story, in 1909 or so, he accosted one of the Wilma sisters after a performance in front of the theater. Liked that show so much, coincidentally ran into her on the sidewalk the next day, and within a year they were married. And they got married in Portland. They lived the first 12 years of their life in Wallace, Idaho. All of her life, she would remember arriving in Wallace, Idaho in December 1909. And how much snow there was, and how back then everybody turned out to see a train, you know? Everybody came out to see what was going to get off the train, what was going to get unloaded, who's getting a grand piano, who's arriving in town. She never forgot that memory. Moved to Missoula in 1920 and immediately set about the business of building her namesake theater. Kind of a difficult engineering feat because it was right on the edge of a river at the time. If you want to step forward, you can see that until the early 1960s, the Wilma came right up to the edge of the water. The north channel of the river flowed right up to the bottom of the Wilma Theater. You can still see like the railing, like right below where that balcony is now, was the river, which made it really easy for people to clean up between shows. To those ushers, you know, Missoula's, for the longest time, has treated this river really horribly. They used to be able to dump your garbage into the river off of the Orange Street Bridge, effectively. And up until 1960, like, yeah, you're an usher at the Wilma, right into the river. Terrible. Another thing, this island, by the way, has a bizarre history all of its own. There have been all kinds of things there, which doesn't make any sense at all to build anything there, because, you know, it floods basically every year. There's an amusement park, built on this. For like a year. If you see some photos, like you see some photos taken from space, you can still see like old concrete fixtures of like wading pools and like the foundations of some of these attractions. Right in the middle of a floodplain. It's not like this thing floods once every 100 years, you know? I guess that like city planning and like, you know, the kind of homework that you're supposed to do before you just go build an amusement park, it's rather evolved since like the 1940s. In any case, boys back in the day used to wade across the southern channel of the river, this would be down by the Milwaukee station, used to wade across that southern channel, walk across the island, and bounce their lures off of the wall of the Wilma. They would try to get into this little fishing hole that was in that north channel. Poking out of the same wall that they bounced their lures off was a couple of pipes dumping raw sewage into their swimming hole. So it took them a while until they worked up the enthusiasm to try one of these fish that they were catching. It's pretty much strictly catch and release back then. They did try one and they said it tasted turpentine, and they never tried it again. Anyway, where was I? My gosh, there's so much stuff to go over. When the Wilma Theater, it's actually called the Smead-Simmons building. His partner, Simmons' partner, his financial partner in building this building that the Wilma is part of, was a guy named Smead, a former Indian agent, pretty crooked is my understanding. But when they started building the Smead-Simmons building, it was going to be, briefly anyway, the tallest building in Montana. It was called Montana's first skyscraper. And the big news that when it opened was not the theater itself, but the swimming pool in its basement. You all know that there's a swimming pool in the basement of the Wilma, right? You can still access it, kind of, you know, if you get the right connections. Just kidding. I don't even have those connections. It's office buildings now, but there used to be a trap door that you could go in, and this is, if you've seen a movie at the Wilma, like prior to 5 years ago, say, maybe you saw it at the street level, like where the parking lot is, that's the old Wilma 3 and 4. It used to be, it's basically like the floor right above the swimming pool. Like right below that floor, like you can open this trap door and essentially walk down into the shallow end of the swimming pool. It's still there. That was a huge draw when the place opened up in the 1920s. Missoula already had plenty of movie theaters in 1920, 1921, so it wasn't like opening a movie theater was a big deal. Right across the street, where they've recently built the new bank, on the site of the ugly old bank that was built on the site of the bank before that, there used to be a little row of theaters there, including the Rialto Theater. And the Rialto was interesting because it had a blind pianist who used to play along with silent movies. No easy feat to be a blind pianist playing along with silent movies. He had a little kid sitting next to him who would whisper cues into his ear. His name was Melvin Book or Bauk, I don't know how you say it. But he had this little kid who would say, like, it's kind of a sappy part, and he would play like the sort of sappy romantic music. You know, it's a stagecoach chase, and he would, like, you know, bust into the, he had like this little interpreter, this blind pianist. Fantastic. So obviously in 1921, Missoula was not lacking for movie or movie culture, but the swimming pool was a huge deal because there wasn't really any public swimming except for lakes and rivers in 1921, and one singularly filthy public pool. There's a parking garage there now. It's down by the Holiday Inn. They just built this new parking garage by the trailhead. And you remember before that it was kind of like scooped out a little bit below street level. That's the site of the swimming pool. It was basically a wide open concrete basin, never covered, collected leaves, dust, you know, moss, lily pads, frogs, I don't even know, but it was supposed to be very filthy swimming. And this is a time when people were still really freaked out about waterborne polio. It had only been a few years before that polio outbreaks in New York and Philadelphia had killed or crippled hundreds and hundreds of people, mostly kids. So in 1921, safe, indoor, supervised public swimming with French fries was a pretty big deal. That was the big draw. The crystal turbine filtration system. All of these bells and whistles about the new swimming pool. Another big thing about the Wilma opening that was related to the movies was the fact that it was fireproof. It was billed to be like a fireproof theater. Does anyone know why fireproof theaters were especially important in the 1920s?
Smoking? Were they everyone smoke?
Yeah, you could definitely smoke in theaters, but the film itself would sometimes spontaneously combust or start on fire. In the old days, like the classic silent movies were made on silver nitrate film, which looks beautiful because it was loaded up with actual silver, but highly, highly dangerous because the actual plastic base that it's on is chemically related to TNT. Very dangerous. Loves to start on fire. Nitrate film loves to burn. Starts burning, burns underwater. You just cannot put this stuff out. And it's a tragedy. I mean, a joke about this is apparently in Victoria or Vancouver, Canada, in the 1920s, a theater burned to the ground because a nitrate print started on fire of a movie they were showing called Safety First. I don't know if it's true, but even in the 20s, there were big tragedies involving this film. The Dromcollar incident in Ireland, an entire movie house packed with barefoot Irish kids up in flames because this film started on fire. It still happens. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, it occasionally happens that this film will spontaneously combust. Even under ideal storage conditions, it will start on fire and take out like an entire national film archive with it. It's happened in France, it's happened in Canada, it's happened in Mexico, where, you know, spontaneously combusting silent film basically wipes out a huge part of that country's filmic record of itself. Extraordinary. The original negatives of Citizen Kane, destroyed on a nitrate fire, all these really important artifacts, a lot of them destroyed by silent film. My gosh, that was a tangent within a tangent within a tangent. A fireproof theater, pretty big deal in the 1920s. The first movie, oh, this is like the million-dollar question, the first movie to show at the Wilma Theater. The Mask of Zorro, Douglas Fairbanks. Cost more to make that movie than it cost to build the Wilma Theater. Isn't that great? Silent movies didn't come to the Wilma until 1929, 1930. They weren't actually the first movie, not actually the first theater in Missoula to show a sound movie. That was the Rialto Theater. Poor Melvin Book, out of a job, you know. It was really expensive, you know, it was really expensive to suddenly go from showing silent movies to being able to show sound movies. Lots of interesting things happened that first week. Not too long after the Wilma was opened, a Hollywood talent scout came to town and encouraged young Missoulians to show up for screen tests at the Wilma. You know, he shot some outdoor scenes, and he also tried out, you know, he did little screen tests for ambitious young starlets and would-be movie stars. I've often wondered what happened to that film, like if it survives anywhere. This glimpse of Montana in the movies in the 1920s. But I don't think so, because they usually destroyed that film. Like, the reason that so much of that film doesn't, I mean, apart from the fact that it occasionally starts on fire, is that like old films were just destroyed. You know, the big reels were chopped in half with an axe if they couldn't be pirated. They were sent off to factories that turned them into things like black powder that reclaimed things from them. In fact, there was the joke that you could be, not a joke, but you could be watching like a flock of ducks on the screen one year, and the next year it would be like actually the black powder in your shotgun that you would take out shooting ducks. Not a whole lot of consideration given to what was going to happen to the film. And that's probably what happened to all those screen tests. Okay, I got some characters to get back to here. Where on earth was I anyway? The Simmons, right. When Billy Simmons died in 1937, that's the guy who built the theater for Edna Simmons, he left his theatrical empire to his wife, who became the female head of one of the most successful theatrical holdings. She was like one of the biggest women in entertainment in terms of owning theaters in the United States, certainly in the Northwest. Did I talk about the Fox Corporation? So you gotta forgive me if I forget what I said. I'm kind of on this big long loop all day and it doesn't complete all the way. The Wilma Theater was partly destroyed from the inside out in the 1940s. Does anybody know why? Because the Wilma Theater used to be held hostage to the Fox Corporation. We know about the Fox Corporation because of 20th Century Fox, right? Well, Fox used to be one of the so-called Big Five Hollywood corporations that owned basically everything. And they had coercive business practices, and they could totally coerce, I mean, not legally, but de facto they owned the Wilma Theater. They had control of the Wilma Theater. If the Wilma Theater didn't want to show Fox movies, they weren't going to get nothing to show. This practice was called block booking, where these entertainment corporations could force theaters into showing the movies that they wanted them to see. It was declared unconstitutional in the 40s, and a decision was handed down called the Paramount Consent that forcibly divested Fox from the Wilma. Like, it basically said, okay, Fox, you got to get out of the Wilma Theater. They did not go quietly. They destroyed the inside of the theater. Actually, the corporation had always done terrible things to the Wilma. In the late 1990s, a considerable amount of money and time was spent in restoring some of the very ornate plasterwork in the lobbies. Anyone notice this? Once upon a time, that was all slathered over with a sickly orange paint. Because in the 1930s, the Fox Corporation decided that they need, you know, with the Great Depression starting to sink in, they wanted to project this image of austerity. Like, people don't want pretty stuff. People don't want ornate plasterwork. People want, you know, baby crap green or some. They wanted to project austerity, so they came in and just painted over everything. In the late 1940s, under the pretense of evacuating their stuff from the Wilma Theater, oh, I just forgot my lunchbox, I'm going to go back to the Wilma Theater. They carted out everything they could. They destroyed everything they could. They threw tons of rope, rigging, theatrical stuff, projection equipment into the river, which, of course, was conveniently located right outside of the exit. I don't know what legal recourse Edna Wilma, who did own the theater back then, I don't know what recourse she took against the Fox Corporation, but I do know that she basically set about building it again from the inside out with her own money. She installed new seats, she installed new decorations, she installed a perfumed fountain in the lobby, which she encouraged women to dip their hankies in before finding their seats. And she eventually married a man who was 25 years younger than her and openly homosexual in the 1940s. Both pretty uncommon things to do. She always said, and that is this guy, Ed Sharp. Ed Sharp, right? It's a bird he's holding there, and more about that bird in just a minute. She married this guy who was, like her, very theatrical, an excellent musician, didn't quite make it in show business, but she always said to the end of her life that she just had way more in common with this guy. I think this is what's called a lavender arrangement, or a marriage of convenience. I think lavender is the word, where it was just a wonderful sort of partnership for both of them, you know, romantic in a way, but just because they were really good friends and they liked a lot of the same things. You'll see that she's buried off to one side. The top stone there is consecrated to the memory of a pigeon, which I'll talk about in a minute, and below that, Edward Sharp, and below him, I should say, is one of the last partners in the Wilma, Bob Sias. I don't exactly know why the graves are arranged thusly, but there's obviously a story there. Ed Sharp, a dyed-in-the-wool Missoula character. Does anyone have an Ed Sharp story? Yeah? Yep, Chapel of the Dove. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he'd sell his popcorn, but his bird would be on his head.
Yes, right. That bird used to take an active hand. Have I talked about the bird and money? This bird took an active hand in like the running of the business, which also included at certain times the Roxy Theater and the Go West Drive-In Theater. Bird used to, quote, help out in the kitchen, you know? In flagrant violation of any number of health regulations. Scrambled eggs. Okay, sorry, more about this bird. This bird, pigeon, and the stone, if you get up close, and feel free to walk around afterwards or during, you can see that it's consecrated in memory of a pigeon named Koro Hato. Hato, I believe, is Japanese for dove or pigeon. Koro is an approximation of the Japanese onomatopoeia for what a pigeon sounds like. Koro, Koro. I do know that Ed Sharp had that bird for 20 years, took care of it, treated it like family, used to fly all. I mean, I moved to Missoula in 1990, a year after Koro Hato supposedly died, but I definitely remember Ed Sharp, like with birds flying around, you know, birds hovering over the almond roca. That was the greatest thing. You know, you couldn't go get like Good and Plenty at the Chapel of the Dove, but you could get these amazing like little almond roca things imported from San Francisco in like their little paper wrapper. I mean, it was always just an extraordinary experience to see a movie there. And of course, birds flying around all over the place. I remember a really eccentric character. You know, of course, all of his clothes were stained on like one little shoulder because like this bird was pooping on him all the time. Scrambled eggs was the bird, Koro Hato's favorite meal. I think that the bird finally asphyxiated at the ripe old age, I imagine, for a bird of 20 on a snowy night coming back to Missoula from Wallace, Idaho. I think that they were moving around and he just didn't survive the car trip. Bird flu or something.
Every cage in this apartment up here died.
Ed Sharp's?
And he used to leave the windows open and the pigeons would come and go, and they had a roost up on the roof.
There was a full dovecote on top of the Wilma. I think he maybe had 300 to 500 up there.
It was significant.
It was amazing pictures. I think that the pigeons were always a source of. I know that he got into trouble with some of his neighbors because they didn't really like 500 pigeons swarming around their parking lot. There was a lot of trouble with neighbors. But he loved him, and this bird, Korohato, I guess was pretty sharp by pigeon standards, could like, you know, could work with money, could handle with money, could make change, you know. I think that Ed could hand him a bill and like the bird would literally go and fly across the drive-in theater or the concession stand and get change from somebody working at another cash register. They say that the bird could tell and was attracted to high denomination bills. You know, given the choice between a 1, a 5, and a 20, the bird would go for the 20 every time. Pretty sharp bird. Any questions so far about these characters? The swimming pool? The swimming pool didn't stick around for very long because it turns out having a swimming pool in your basement is pretty tough on your building. You know, they're humid, they're moist, a lot of chemicals involved. But then again, man, you know how, can you imagine what that was like? Ground floor swimming, lifeguards. You can still see some of these old brass fixtures. You can still see pieces of like the lifeguard stand in these office buildings. At least last time I stuck my head in, which was probably 3 years ago, you could still see some of the brass fittings that once upon a time would have been around the pool. Snack bar. I mean, really, you know how good French fries taste after you've been swimming? How good they smell after you've been swimming? Oh, what a great time that must have been. Crystal plunge. Any questions, comments about the place? You gotta forgive me, I sort of forget where I've been with this group. See what else I forgot. More about the Wilma sisters, I guess. Edith Wilma died in 1932. Later in life, much later in life, like her sister, she married a ventriloquist, another former vaudeville performer. And his claim to fame, I would give my eye teeth for a recording of this, but his claim to fame, her husband, and I didn't bring a picture of him, I'm sorry, but his name was Ketch, and his vaudeville act was that he could sing and harmonize with himself in 3 voices simultaneously. I cannot tell you how long how much time I've spent sitting around trying to imagine what that would sound like and how you would do that. And just, how do you do that? How do you sing 3 things at the same time? I've seen movies about these, you know, Mongolian throat singers and Tibetan monks who have like learned how to free up certain resonating chambers and, you know, kind of making more of like their sound apparatus than most of us do. I don't know if you guys have heard any throat singing. I think the answer is halfway there, but I just can't imagine how you could do all of those little errands at the same time. Sing and harmonize with yourself. I love it. If you ever find a Ketch record, let me know. I will pay top dollar. We got any questions about this place? About the current state of the Wilma, I can't say much. I think it's been sold again recently, like over the summer. My understanding is that there's not as much focus on movies at the Wilma anymore, more of a live venue. But that's just something you kind of hear on the playground. I don't really know the whole story there. I do know that the Wilma has a fantastic shaggy dog history, and some of the things that supposedly happened there just stagger belief. But in the meantime, that's about all I got. Thanks. Feel free to come and have a look. All these things are back here.